Mm-hmm.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sam, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for our first event of December with Philip Gefter in conversation with Charlotte Cotton to discuss his new book, What Becomes a Legend Most, a biography of Richard Avedon. Thank you both so much for being here. This is where everyone would clap if we were in the store. We will be hosting more virtual events in the near future. We don't have many for December, so if you want to catch us before the new year, check our Crowdcast page, our website to see which ones. You can also follow us on social media at Book Soup. You can sign up for our email newsletter, and you can check the website if you like. And past events are available on our Crowdcast page as well as our YouTube channel. Our next event is scheduled for tomorrow at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard with New York Times bestselling author Jen Sincero to discuss her new book, Badass Habits. And that is a ticketed event, so if you are interested, find a ticket. Tonight's event will end with a Q&A, and to submit a question, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. It's to the left of the chat area. And if you see a question on the list that you'd like for our speakers to answer, please click the like button and it will bump it up in the queue. And we will try to answer as many questions as time will allow. Also, please support Book Soup. As you know, independent bookstores really could use your support this year and always. And to support our author tonight by purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book, which you can do by clicking on the green button below the viewer screen. It will redirect you to our website and it will not interrupt the presentation. So you can do that at any time throughout. And you can continue the checkout process there. And with all that said, let me introduce our guest speakers for this evening. Philip Gefter is the author of two previous books, Wagstaff Before and After Maplethorpe, which received the 2014 Marfield Prize and was a finalist for a Lambda Literary Award for Best Biography Memoir, and a collection of essays, Photography After Frank. He was an editor at the New York Times for over 15 years and wrote regularly about photography for the paper. He produced the 2011 documentary, Bill Cunningham, New York. He lives in New York City, and you can find more at www.philipgefter.com. Our other special guest this evening is Charlotte Cotton, who is an independent curator of and writer about photography. She has held positions including head of the Wallace Annenberg Photography Department at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, head of programming at the Photographers Gallery, and curator of photography at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Her books about fashion include Imperfect Beauty, The Making of Contemporary Fashion Photographs, Guy Borden, and most recently, Fashion Image Revolution. She is the editor of the photography readers Words Without Pictures, Public, Private, Secret on Photography and the Configuration of Self, and the author of Photography as Magic. Her revised fourth edition of the Photography as Contemporary Art was published in September this year. Charlotte is the inaugural artistic director of Taswir, a photography biennial program of exhibitions, grant awards, and research programs in Qatar, launching this coming March. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to our guests this evening. Thank you both so much. We're so excited to have you. And everyone sit back, relax, and enjoy the presentation.
Hi.
Hi. I'm just trying to take a few deep breaths because I am already overexcited about producing, about your incredible book. There's so much to say and it'll come up in my questions. So I'm going to cut to the chase and move into my first kind of question to you. So I could not have thought of a better excuse to take 2 days off and lie in bed and read your book. I devoured your book, all over 560 pages. I mean, first of all, congratulations on writing so beautifully, regardless of the subject. You are just an incredible writer and a structuring of stories. It's a very compelling book, regardless of it being this absolutely fascinating subject. And what struck me as so incredible about the way that you write is just not only this kind of very gripping and relatable way that you write stories, but I was just thinking about you writing this book, thinking that's sheer tenacity to sustain, to do all of that research, to find the stories, to kind of allow the reader to kind of swoop in and be at a party in 1972 and then telescope out and think about the context within which he was working. I mean, it's incredible. You know, occasionally I read biographies, and a few pages in, sometimes you can get that horrible feeling of like, oh no, the wrong person is writing this book. And either they're just too close to the subject, you know, they're sort of holding on to something, or they don't have necessarily the sort of emotional intelligence or slant onto a subject to really be generous to think through a full rounded life. And I didn't feel like either of those emotions or at any point in the book. So I want to start by asking you about where the seeds were sown for your resourcefulness and clear passion to write a story of Richard Avedon. Where does it start for you?
Well, I would go back to the early 70s when I was in art school at Pratt Institute studying painting and photography. And I was so surprised at the attitude about photography of my classmates and these other art students and teachers and even the art world. Photography was considered a kind of a second-class citizen. It was considered not much more than a graphic art. And that sort of appalled me. And it sort of sparked my quiet indignation that has lasted most of my life. This prejudice against photography, and I sort of set myself up in my mind as an advocate for the medium. From my perspective, even then, I thought, this is the medium of the future. I mean, to me, it was just an obvious thing. And so I think it started at that moment. Several years later, I went to see the Avedon show at Marlborough Gallery in 1975. It was his first commercial gallery show. And I was just blown away. I mean, the work itself was eye-popping. It had such bold graphic punch. And it was radical at that time to have photographs that were like wall-sized, where there was nothing in the frame. The frame was reduced to nothing but the subject in the frame. That was pretty both economical and pretty zappy. Not only that, the photographs, the portraits themselves were, it was a pantheon of artists and writers and poets, major artists, writers and poets. So all of that was just kind of, I thought, wow, amazing. And yet the critical reaction was, the art critics were really resistant to Avedon. They sort of acknowledged that it was high style, but they wouldn't allow that this was real, serious art making. That was true of Avedon's career. That was true of photography itself. I watched slowly the elevation in stature of photography over the last quarter of the 20th century, until eventually there was some genuine acceptance of the medium in the art world. So fast forward, over the years, I learned a few things about the history of photography and some things about art history. And in the early 2000s, I was the page one picture editor at the New York Times. And in 2004, one day I walk into the newsroom and learn that Richard Avedon had died. And so I go to the top editors to say, this is obviously a page one obituary, just alerting you. And
obviously.
They kind of, I thought, obviously, they look at me and look at each other and shrug and go, Richard Avedon? Not necessarily. And I realized at that moment that they still considered him a fashion photographer and a celebrity photographer, despite the fact that he had had a major retrospective at the Metropolitan Museum of Art 2 years earlier and had been shown at myriad museums around the country. So I realized at that moment, I want to write his biography. He, to me, was a kind of avatar, like exhibit A, in terms of photography's struggle to be recognized in the art world. So that's the germ of the idea. I just want to add one more thing, which is that
Do it.
I also have a kind of a weakness for glamour, and he sort of represented that as well. So the combination was kind of riveting to me.
Yeah, it's kind of, it covers. I share that, and I don't even think it's a weakness. I think it's definitely an asset. So you start the book, chapter 1, you start with the 1975 Marlborough Gallery exhibition, which is a great way to start, just to have one of those kind of scenarios sort of implanted. Like, okay, we're here in the first chapter. And then really from chapter 2 onwards, you go through his early life. And I just love the way that you start the book really well with one of these moments, which is really pivotal to his creative journey and his cultural standing. And they sort of staccato through the book. Like, you get very used to that tempo. Like, okay, where's the glamorous moment where we're all, it's a very crowded room of extraordinary people. And then another sort of staccato tempo you have in the book is just moments where, I mean, just when you see the sort of fate, just extraordinary coincidences of his life, where I gasp. But I'll get to my point here, like, because the thoroughness of the work that you do in terms of his early life is just, it's really extraordinary, because it's not two-dimensional. Like, it's not like, I'm going to tell you something about his early life, and so we'll treat that as cause, and then we'll look at effect. It's not as literal as this happened to him, and therefore this happened. And I felt that particularly around the really sensitive way that you write about family. So on the one hand, one of the through lines about relationality and family through the book is the fact that Avedon came from a family on both sides of his family where there was paternal abandonment of the family. And so, you know, but you don't treat that as a cliche. It's really well paced through the book.
Thank you.
But then additional to that is that sort of sense of his biography as what was truly formative to who he was as a creative person. And of course, I'm thinking particularly about his relationship with his cousin, Margie. As a child and a young adult, and the significance of that relationship. And I appreciated that as somebody who I think sort of works mainly on the sibling register. It's like, I'm done with patriarchy. So sibling is really the kind of the nugget of taking risks, of collaborating, of creating. So it was very relatable, the way that you set up that relationship not as a cliche that explains what he did, but as really the DNA of what he did. And I wonder if you could say more about that relationship and what you think its consequences were on his creative journey.
Well, Margie, I mean, I'm going to call Richard Avedon Dick. Everybody called him Dick, and I think of him as Dick at this point.
Slightly more difficult if you're English to say that, but we'll go with Dick.
So Dick and Margie were very close. She was his cousin, 2 years older than he, and they had a sibling-like relationship. They were like these, you know, mischievous co-conspirators who were always kind of exploring the world together. And Margie was, she was provocative, she was imaginative, she was mischievous. She was kind of all these wonderful things that I will talk about in a little while as Margie being the prototype for the Avedon woman. We'll talk about that in terms of his fashion work. But Margie would introduce Dick to, you know, things she was discovering before he could get there, and both scandalizing him and thrilling him at the same time. So when they were teenagers, they both started writing poetry, and Margie was very precocious, and she was publishing her poems in national magazines at the age of 15, 16, and 17. So I mean, this was a seminal relationship for him, and again, I think prototypical for the kind of woman he would choose to be his model and the way that he photographed his models. I want to actually segue into, we had talked before about the kind of the nugget, like what did I need to understand about Dick in order to write this book?
Exactly.
And this corresponds perfectly. So it took me almost a year to realize that the significance of the fact that Dick wanted to be a poet. And in high school, I mean, he wrote poetry, he read poetry. He and Margie would write poetry together. He was the co-editor of his literary magazine with no less than James Baldwin, his friend and schoolmate. That James Baldwin, and this was only one. This is one in a lifelong string of kind of wild coincidences of fate that brought him together with James Baldwin, and later with Leonard Bernstein and Truman Capote and Harold Brodkey and endless people. But so the fact that he wanted to be a poet, and he wrote poetry and published probably over a dozen poems. Most of them in a literary magazine, but also a few in newspapers. At the age of 17, he won a New York Citywide High School Poetry Award that landed him his first write-up in the New York Times at the age of 17.
Wow.
He unfortunately he didn't really have either the courage or maybe it was practical. Maybe he just knew that he could not make a life as a poet, or he didn't feel he could, and so he ended up in photography. And so when he started doing his work, well, let me just say this. So that to me is the nugget. It's like he brought that poetic impulse to everything he did, like in his photographic work, both the fashion work and the portraiture. And I can talk about that. I don't know if we want to segue into that or not, but in terms of the fashion, you have questions about the fashion work, and we can talk about that then. I think.
Well, I think that was a real surprise to me. I mean, not only like the twists of fate that he would go to high school with James Baldwin,
yes,
but also this idea of poetry as, I mean, both a reality of like how his creative juices started to flow and how that would impact on some of the choices he's made, balanced with, I think, also a sense of somebody who, partly because of that sort of early collaborative, creative, strangely intimate relationship with Margie, a bit like working with a stylist or an art director or people that he worked with in his professional life, but still that sort of like, I'll push you, you push me, we'll take risks together, that kind of way of working. But I think also just that way in which got a sense that then there's some like hard choices that he was strategically making at a very young age, like the idea it's not going to be poetry's going to make me miserable and I want something else. Like, where would you go to have the most impact if you were a young creative person in New York at that particular moment?
Exactly. And so he zeroed into Harper's Bazaar. Like at the age of 21, he became, with pure rigor and ambition, he decided he wanted to work for Harper's Bazaar. He met with, he scheduled at least 14 appointments with Alexei Brodovich, who was the towering figure in graphic design in the 20th century. And finally, after 14 appointments, he would go, he would get dressed up, take his portfolio, go in the waiting room. They would say, "I'm sorry, Mr. Brodovich can't see you today. You'll have to come back." So his pure persistence and ambition drove him to do that. The reason why is that it's not that he wanted to be a fashion photographer. I think that it's my supposition that basically Harper's Bazaar was one of the best magazines at the time, not only for fashion, but he was reading. His parents got Harper's Bazaar, and he was reading Harper's Bazaar, and they published some of the best literature, of that era. I mean, he was reading William Faulkner and Virginia Woolf, and Christopher Isherwood published the story Sally Bowles in Harper's Bazaar in 1937. It was quite literate, and I think he just wanted to be in the center of culture, and working for Harper's Bazaar gave him that access. And he ended up photographing fashion, and that was a wonderful thing for him. He was delighted.
Yeah.
And I'll go on. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, you go on.
So I was going to say that. So he lands at Harper's Bazaar. He is taken to Paris by Carmel Snow, the editor-in-chief, who is a pretty interesting woman in her own right. And her mandate after World War II, when he just started working at Harper's Bazaar, he was 22. Her mandate was to resuscitate the fashion industry in Paris after World War II. And so he, wanted Dick to photograph Paris. So Dick is known to kind of have revolutionized fashion photography, mid-century. And it's often cited that he brought the model out of the studio and into the street. And he wasn't the first to do that. Other photographers had done that, but he did it with such elan. And this is where the poetry will come in a second. I call him the impresario of the fleeting visual metaphor, because he would photograph these women in situations that, whether it's a model / woman, in a square watching street performers in Balenciaga, or playing pinball at the Café des Beaux-Arts in Givenchy, or staving off elephants, in Dior. He was photographing, and this is the poet. This is the poet in him. This is what I determined is he was photographing a condition of spontaneity. It wasn't even the dress, and it wasn't even the circumstance, although the circumstance was clearly an image that he was creating, the way a poet creates images with putting one word next to another and creating a rhythm. He did that visually, but it's really this kind of remarkable quality of spontaneity that exists in the work. And I think that that's the poet in him. That's what he was after. And that, to me, is what's revolutionary about his fashion work.
Yeah. That is extraordinary way of looking at it. And I really appreciate that, because that really is so specific to him. I mean, in a general sense, you'd say truly great fashion people who, by fate or deep intelligence or persistence, create the visuals of the time. It relies. It's deathly unless it has that capacity to capture the fleeting in some way, whether it's the edge of the backdrop, the sort of reveal, or whether it is this kind of contradiction or something just happening, which this preconceived frame allows to happen, and that space to allow that to happen. And to think about that in terms of poetry for him is extraordinary. I wondered if you would like to show some images and tell us why you would make the claim that his
why don't we?
Are so revolutionary.
We have, I just put together about 12 pictures, and we can go through them quickly. But just to show you what I'm talking about, this was his first Harper's Bazaar cover. He was 23 years old. It's in 1947. And it was pretty radical at that moment in time, even though it seems completely tame and of its time today. But at that moment, to see a woman who seemed so kind of free and free-spirited, even standing that way, that became part of what was known as the Avedon woman, is even the way that his models stand. Well, I was going to say other things about this, but anyway, the other thing I'll say about this is that you can see, it's so interesting. At first glance, it looks like she's a woman on the beach, until you take a second look and you realize that it was made in the studio, and he doesn't hide the fact that it's in the studio. You see the backdrop is actually studio backdrop paper, and she's standing on a hard wood floor. But he's created this idea about the beach out of kind of nothing, and he has photographed her, posed her in such a way that she is she just seems like she could just step right out of the frame. Anyway, we can go on. I just want to.
I mean, just to say that I think one of the powers of a truly great fashion photographer, of which Avedon is up there, is that capacity of where they put the viewer. Like I really I really rate those photographers who let me, as the viewer, a woman reading a magazine, into the joke. And I feel that construct of the beach is a really delicate version of that. Of course, like, it reveals itself. And
Yes.
like, the joke's not on me. It's not about duping me. It's about saying, okay, let's abstract this. Like, there's a curiosity towards the viewer.
It's like a wink. It's like a wink, wink.
Exactly.
You know, happily. I'm showing some of these pictures on the magazine page because that's exactly what he was photographing these for. And I mean, we don't have to linger on it. I mean, there's a lot going on in this frame. I always say that you look at these pictures and it's as if a breeze is always blowing through them. And that's also another quality of what I call the spontaneity that he's able to capture. So here's just, I mean, they're just examples. I mean, we can go on. Just hold this for 1 minute, look at this picture, and then we're going to go to the next one, and I'm going to make a kind of photographic point. Okay, Sam, you can go to the next. So this picture was taken at the same, like during the same shoot. And you see the difference between the picture that was used in the magazine and this picture, which Dick printed later. And this is the more official version of that shoot that is used periodically in exhibitions. And so the point I want to make is that one picture was used for the page and another was considered for the wall. And I mean, this is much more formal. I actually like this picture better, but I do see why the other one worked on the page. It had movement and it was active and, you know, it sort of works that way.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. I think this picture is amazing. I mean, I think it's as if you were right there. It's as if you're at some lively restaurant and you're being shown to your table and you're walking by her table and you're just sort of glimpsing her as you walk by. And she's in the middle of a moment. And I talk about this in the book. And at the end, I say, what is she looking at? She's looking at the future. Because this picture was taken in 1949 and it was kind of on the cusp of different things going on culturally. Anyway, that's a digression. But
Well, and I love this image as well. And looking at it now with you, I think the reason for me might be some of my favorite fashion photographers. And I think in the way that Avedon constructs a place for me as a viewer is many of them. I'm thinking of like someone like Corinne Day, for example, where she gives you that feeling when you're looking at the photographs that you could be looking at a friend or a sibling, and it's like you just in the way that you might say to a friend sitting across the table, "Oh, I really love your earrings. They look really nice." Like there's something very plausible about who this character is, rather than and you feel that. And I reading the biography, it really impressed on me that rather, if you just start to sort of break down these actual relationships that he had with women, there's something of that kind of sibling or good friend,
indeed,
in a non-sexual way, just affection.
Exactly. And that's, we can talk about that later too, but that's part of the Margie factor. It's also part of Dick's approach to women, which was much more, it was not erotic. I mean, it was almost sibling or, you know, a kind of intimate friendship. Well, I mean, this is an exception. I was going to say that many of his women are he photographs them in a way that makes it seem that they're completely accessible. That you're right there with them, you know, it's just as you describe. I mean, this is somewhat different. I mean, this is, you know, arguably his most kind of famous, well-known image, and now most expensive. But
also the visuals of the time, in terms of that's how extraordinarily kind of extravagant and powerful being an editorial photographer in you know, Harper's Bazaar or Vogue. Like, you would literally climb the Himalayas with a suitcase of furs, or you would it would
except
be the Mi'kmaq and the elephants. It's like
yes, except that of course
possible.
Of course, this was taken at the Cirque d'Hiver, which is a circus in Paris. I mean, it's a real structure. I mean, it's been there for 150 years, and this is the in the animal hold, and there were 4 elephants lined against a wall, and there was an animal trainer, and so it was very tame. But of course, you know, I see this photograph metaphorically as, you know, it's man or culture taming nature, you know, taming the kind of deep instinctive forces of nature. And I mean, there are these elephants stopping for this, you know, perfect creature in Dior, a dress actually designed by Yves Saint Laurent, who was an assistant to Dior. But that's a little digression too.
It's all there. Okay, I think it's time to refer to one of your chapters, which is called The Closet Door.
Okay. Well, we can go back to that. Should we just finish this quickly and then go to that? Or,
yeah, I'm pacing you. Keep the pace up.
Okay. So let's just go through this quickly. Let's just finish, like, Sam, a few more. You get the idea of the, you know, fleeting visual metaphor, ideally. And that. And then we'll hold the closet door thought, because we're just going to make one more point here, and then we can go on to the next pictures. Yeah. So there was, the Avedon woman was actually a thing. It was a phenomenon in the 50s, and it was talked about and written about, and it was this trope. And I've sort of described, we've talked about what that Avedon woman is. It's sort of, you know, Margie being the prototype, and kind of free-thinking, freewheeling, independent, curious, somewhat kooky. Go back, Sam, for 1 second. Individual. This is Audrey Hepburn as Holly Golightly in the movie Breakfast at Tiffany in 1961. I don't think Dick had anything to do with this movie, but just the fact of her styling, the fact of what Audrey Hepburn looked like in this movie is kind of the apotheosis of the Avedon woman as a trope of 50s fashion and attitude. So I just want to make that point. Now we can go to the next picture. And so on the right is Audrey Hepburn as Holly Golightly. On the left is Margie. Margie, at this point, Marjorie Lederer Lee, Dick's cousin. She's grown up. She's written, this is maybe the author picture that he took of her for her second novel. She wrote 3 novels and a book of poetry, and she was quite accomplished. And he basically turns her into the Avedon woman. She was so not like this. I mean, she was completely cultivated and accomplished. She was a little more bohemian than this. But he basically fashioned her as herself in his mind, the Avedon woman, the prototype of the Avedon woman. And here she is, the apotheosis of it. Anyway, that's the point I want to make.
That's such a find of a picture. It's perfect.
It's great. Okay, so we can go to the blank for now. Thanks. So the closet. What do you want to know about the closet?
Well, I wanted to commend you because, you know, you don't swerve Avedon's latent or definitely not public homosexuality. And at the same time, you don't it's not the reveal of the book either.
Right.
So I really appreciated the balance of it. And also the way that you introduced the ideas of why that shame, beyond the historical context, why that shame would be so embedded in him. But I think the question really for me is, did you know that when you started writing? Did you know about his relationships with men or any of this?
I didn't. So I'll just say that, you know, when I began my research, I knew that Dick was married and had a grown son, and he had been married for 50 some odd years. That's really all I knew. However, truth be told, because I'm gay, I sort of had surprise. I have, I suspected it, and I can't tell you why, other than like what I sensed in the way that he photographed what his pictures looked like. One of the things I set out to do at the beginning of the book was to try to understand try to identify what the combination of qualities were that created his sensibility. I felt like I couldn't write the book unless I understood that. And that took some kind of, intuitive, circumnavigating and, and a lot of research. And so I suspected, but I was not, given the fact that I'm a great believer in scholarship, and, I wrote for the Times for years. And so I, only let the evidence drive me. I would not, make just suppositions and assumptions. So what started to happen is, as I was interviewing friends of his, people who worked with him, professional acquaintances, invariably during the interview, they would ask me if Dick was gay. And I would say to them, I didn't know Dick. You knew Dick. You tell me whether or not he was gay. So I started to realize, this was a question that followed him around like forever. And he was very, basically, I think Dick was so focused on his work that he, whatever his romantic and sexual life was, he really kept it compartmentalized. I'll put it that way. But I did, so in talking to these various people, anecdotes would start to surface, and, occasionally a letter that he wrote that revealed something. So I was able to follow a trail of kind of evidence that led me to realize that I think he was gay, and that given his generation, given what homosexuality was, how it was considered in, between the world wars and even later, even when I was growing up, that it was the worst taboo. And it was illegal, and it could destroy your life and destroy careers. And in one real hard piece of evidence was a letter that he wrote to his friend Lillian Bass when she was in Paris, and he sort of alluded to the fact that he had started to see this analyst who was noted for curing homosexuality. And this was pre-conversion therapy, at least pre the term. And so, I thought, okay, this seems pretty credible. And anyway, I came to understand that. And over the course of my research and, meeting this person and that person and kind of doing research, and, I realized that he probably spent his life, he just didn't want those feelings. He didn't want to have them. He felt enormous, shame and guilt about them. And the way I approached it in the book is that I wrote about it in terms of kind of the context of his generation and, his own life and career. And I was very sympathetic to, the shame and the guilt that he experienced, because he was not alone in that. I mean, an entire, population of gay people lived in the closet. So anyway, so there's that.
There was, I wonder, the moment which just really broke my heart was you researched and found a story of him at high school camp.
Yeah, it's a tragic story. The way to tell the story is that, when he was 11 or 12, he went to see Top Hat and fell madly in love with Fred Astaire, the idea of Fred Astaire. And so he was in this survivalist camp that his father had sent him to. His father was very autocratic, and they did not get along. And he was very overbearing and demanding.
What's the worst thing I could do to my son? I know.
Exactly. Well, he wasn't. It wasn't that he did it sadistically, but he did it to try to fortify his son to deal with the real world. And so he sent him to the survival camp. And Dick was, he was a scrawny little kid. He was unathletic, and he was taunted and ridiculed, and he wasn't happy at this camp. there was one bunkmate of his who paid him some kindness, I guess, in the locution of that era, and he sort of fell in love with him. He was like, I think Dick was 13 at this time, and so he convinced one of the counselors who was who was putting on the camp kind of whatever it's called, musical or something, if he could perform a tap dance number at intermission, if Dick could, and he did, and at the end of that tap dance performance, he saw his friend, his inamorati, in the audience, and he bowed and blew a kiss to him. Well, this was kind of the kiss of death, because of course the inamorati looked at him in the audience, and he did this and left, stormed out. And Dick understood at that moment that he made this hideous, horrible faux pas and that he could be killed. Yeah. Literally, his life was in danger at that moment, because all of those, 13-year-old boys would kill him. And so he called his father to come get him. And he told 2 hours away from New York, and told his father that there were anti-Semitic slurs being hurled at him, and so his father, of course, came to pick him up. It's a tragic story,
isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I would like to take us into our final kind of area, and which is probably the motherlode.
Yes, it is.
So
actually.
I'm conscious of that, which is obviously Portraiture, and
yes.
One of the things that you set up in the book is really, even though you're meticulous with the whole of his life, and I think you write brilliantly about setting the scene for what it meant to be a top fashion photographer in all of that period, and also, as you were saying, to be back to your kind of being a student at Pratt, you're really giving the evidence for why it's really purely academic if you want to sort of separate out and compartmentalize photography from art, but also fashion photography from art photography or portraiture, etc. So, but I think that you do share with what I think you're saying about Avedon is that he believed that his true legacy was in his portraiture, and that
as do I.
Yeah, exactly. So tell me about
so why? Okay.
legacy. Yeah, why?
Oh boy, so why? So I think, to Dick's consternation, for years and years and years, he was called a celebrity photographer. And, and yes, it's true. His reputation was built on his photographs of, Marilyn Monroe and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor and Truman Capote and various other people. But at a certain moment in his life, at the late 60s, his sort of deeper kind of artistic imperatives kicked in. And I think, he started making portraits with more serious artistic intention. To wit, no one in his portraits is smiling against that white nuclear backdrop. They are, very serious portraits. And the white nuclear backdrop, like I like to call it, is that, Dick was of a generation that was on alert to the threat of the nuclear bomb. That was a kind of existential leitmotif for that entire generation. And I think what he was doing, and he even talked about this, he was kind of in search of that sense of dread, which is something that he felt and he, was looking at in the people he was photographing. I think he put people, he photographed them like specimens, of the species that could annihilate itself. They were specimens under the forensic scrutiny of his lens. And he would often say, when people called him a celebrity photographer, he would say, don't think about who they are, just look at their faces. There's a quote, if I could find it somewhere. I don't know that I can. Anyway, never mind. I can't. Oh, here it is. He said, later in his life, he said, "I'm not impressed with the fact of Eisenhower. It doesn't interest me that he was president of the United States," who he photographed, "or that Pearl Mesta is a hostess. It interests me that they all have to face their death, and that the terror is in all of us and in my portraits. I don't think it's so important who they are. We're all born the same, and we all end up the same way. So I think when you look at the totality of his portraiture, he was photographing, an entire kind of society of an era, not only the pantheon of arts and letters, but also in his amazing body of work, The Family, the power structure of America. And then in the American West, the anonymous everyman. So let's look at some pictures, and we can do it. I'll just give you a little example. You can see that he's photographing everyone in the same way. And I'll just tell you who they are as we look at them. Robert Frank, Jasper Johns, Bill Curry, a drifter in Oklahoma, Willem de Kooning, Lee Friedlander, Jeannie Banta, a waitress in Idaho, Renata Adler, David Beeson, a shipping clerk, James Galanos, major fashion designer, Lyle Burr, a coal miner with his sons in Utah. He looks like he could be a CEO of a major corporation. And Katharine Graham. So you see that they're interchangeable insofar as they're all, he photographed them all in the same way. And the fact that he reduced the frame to nothing but the subject requires that you actually look at them. You look at who they are. There's nothing else to distract you. You're face to face with them. There's no difference. Well, there is of course difference between, Katharine Graham and the waitress in Idaho. He sort of like equalizes, the human race in a way that I think is brilliant. And what's so frustrating for me is that it was considered for years by critics as a formula instead of a signature, and I consider it a signature.
Yeah, I mean, I just, in terms of my response to that, what I appreciated is, I think I came in as somebody, different generation and different kind of critical understanding of what portraiture is, and with some cynicism about, like, I think, there's other photographers who come out of fashion who kind of do these portrait series, and they sort of, I call it, there's, photographer ranking, who's great, but I always say, oh, you've been rankinized. And it's like, it's like, and it's like you're joining, and so I have some ambivalence towards that, like, who are you to do this, and to define who comes into the kind of specimen tray. Right. And also but then reading the book, I think the way that you set it up was extraordinary. And the way in which, I mean, there's some art history in your book as well. And it's thinking through the connections that he made. And I suppose you created a space where actually I accepted your argument that his greatest legacy is the portraiture, and also that it was a real challenge for him to be accepted, not only his portraiture to be accepted as art, but lots of prejudices against fashion, against a certain level of wealth and affluence and privilege that kind of colours this. And you deal with all of that, and the work still, but the work is really, that is the legacy in terms of how do you create an Egon Schiele of in
Exactly,
Avedon's case,
voila,
20th
yeah,
century,
exactly.
right?
Look at this picture right here. It's
Right.
it's like an Egon Schiele. Thank you, Sam. That was perfect timing with that picture and the reference to Egon Schiele. I mean, the thing about his portraiture is that I mean, I think like all great artists, the work becomes more coherent in time.
Right.
And you look at Avedon's portraits today, and don't they make impeccable sense? Just look at us. Look at this little panel of three of us. You know, he's made pictures that actually are so relevant to this moment in time in terms of, you know, bringing everything to the surface. I mean, we are all at the moment living in the Matrix, you know, and his pictures fit right into like, they're so coherent. They make so much sense to me. Anyway.
Yeah, and I think I mean, one of the other aspects of it for me is you started this portrait sequence with the portrait of Robert Frank, and
right.
What you also tackle in the book is, first of all, I mean, you deal with the sort of like the sort of, you know, mud wrestling titans of Irving Penn and Richard Avedon. You know, who's the best?
Right.
You deal with that, but you don't overplay that by any
right.
And so what was really appealing was the fact that actually you talked about what Robert Frank meant to him,
yes,
and how he felt that Frank mirrored back to him in lots of ways which were not comfortable.
Right.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, no, that to me, I mean, that's a very interesting relationship. Not that they had a relationship. I mean, you know,
No.
Robert Frank, you know, dismissed Richard Avedon as being, he actually had a term for it, a Sammy. And a Sammy was kind of, I call it it's a moral slur on Robert Frank's time. Sammy refers to Sammy Glick in the novel, What Makes Sammy Run, which is about a rags to riches story novel about a guy from the ghetto who elbows his way to the top of the Hollywood studio system. And my generation would call him a yuppie. You know, and so basically Frank thought of Richard Avedon as a sellout. Right. But Avedon understood that Robert Frank was the real thing. And, you know, Robert Frank was not known. I mean, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, most people in the world did not know the name Robert Frank. I mean, only pretty much, you know, a certain coterie of the photography world and, you know, some downtown artists understood who he was, but nobody really knew. But Dick knew. And I set that up. It's really important to me in terms of kind of a history of photography thread, which is that I'll be quick about this. Robert Frank represented kind of the authentic moment in documenting the authentic moment, or what's called street photography. I don't like to categorize him that way, but he's lumped into that, versus the studio. And so when those are both kind of threads of,
right.
of, you know, photographic, you know, production, art making, the street versus the studio. In most of the last quarter of the 20th century, you know, authentic documentation was the backbone of art photography, and the studio was dismissed as, you know, fatuous and artificial. That's been changing lately, but Dick, you know, was the studio and Robert Frank was the street, and that's another reason why Dick was dismissed even in the art world, even in the world of photography, like at the curatorial level for many years. Anyway.
Well, talking curatorial, another one of the great through lines that you just really sensitively play out is his relationship with John Tchaikovsky.
Yes, that was a big deal. And I mean, I could go on for 10 minutes about that, but I won't. I'll just be very brief.
Well, maybe I should just preempt this by saying to everyone, we're going to open up to questions. So now's the time to start composing your questions in the chat.
So Dick and John Tchaikovsky met in the early 60s, and they had a very cordial, friendly relationship. And in 1968, John Tchaikovsky was the curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art, a legendary curator who basically established kind of a canon for photography that's now like shape-shifting its way to kind of some new something. But I don't know how to, I mean, I could define that if I had a minute or two. But anyway, so
don't dig the hole any deeper, please.
So John Tchaikovsky invited Avedon to have a retrospective at MoMA, and this is 1968, and that was a huge thing. That was, he didn't invite just anybody. I mean, you had to pass his, you know, velvet rope, let's say. And so Dick he said, great, wonderful. He said, I have another body of work I want to do before we have this retrospective. Is that possible? And John said, sure. In the interim, Dick accepted an exhibition at the Minneapolis Institute of Art in 1970 and was very excited about it, and wrote to John and said, I'm doing the show, you know, they're going to pay for all of the framing and, you know, all the shipping. And so that will, you know, save the museum from doing that. And it's being installed in a certain way. I'd love you to come look at it. Well, John Tchaikovsky, you know, was an original thinker, very territorial, and was like completely offended by Dick doing this. But I mean, he didn't show it. Basically, the way he showed it is that, you know, he would write, they would have correspondence, and he would write to Dick saying, "Dear Dick, blah blah blah," and all of a sudden the correspondence changed, and it was, from then on, it was "Dear Richard," and there was kind of an arm's length relationship between them, so that by the time Dick had his show at MoMA, it was not till 1974. It was not a retrospective. It was the show of photographs of his father in a single room on the ground floor of the museum. And after that, there was a chill around Richard Avedon's name at the Museum of Modern Art for the rest of the century.
Yeah.
So it was not his work. It was his personality. This is a point I make. Yes. And it's an important distinction that I hope will revise art history a little bit.
Wow, I think, but also it's like you really feel for him in terms of, I describe some characters that I meet in the photo world as relentlessly charming. And, you know, I imagine that
yes,
he
was
one of those.
Yeah,
it was like, come, stay at this amazing hotel, have a beautiful, perfect, poetic, you know, perfect dinner, and we'll discuss, and you feel yourself being sort of dragged into this kind of vortex of control and
of need and control, and, you know, elbowing their way in. No, I understand.
So I don't get to play Margie. You want me to do something else, right? We're not going to play.
So should we? I don't know what our time is like. If we should go to questions,
we have one question, which we have a number, not quite questions, but one good question which sort of breaks our cycle is, Philip, could you please tell us about the two photographs behind you? Thank you.
Oh. Well, this one is Hank Wessel, and this one is John O'Reilly, and they're in our dining room. There it is.
Do you have any Avedon pictures?
No, I do not. I could not afford them.
I
have zillions. I have 14 Avedon photography books, so I can look at them anytime I want. But
I was like, I could barely afford. I don't think I can afford those books. How did you do this in terms of your visual journey? Because obviously, the illustrations are limited, as you would expect.
Right, exactly.
A literary biography, and it's not an illustrated book. But how did the visual inform the way that you put the story together, or did you keep that quite separate?
It was kind of the alchemy of my biographical process. I mean, I would put pictures together and I would look at them, and one thing would lead me to another. And so one example I could show you, but let's not go put the slides back up. When Dick photographed Robert Frank in Nova Scotia in 1975, the next day he made a self-portrait. I didn't know that the self-portrait that I knew was made the next day. It took me about 8 months before I discovered that that self-portrait was made the day after he photographed Robert Frank. It's a very unusual self-portrait for Dick because he's completely uncoiffed and his shirt's open and he's kind of, he doesn't have his kind of urbane gloss. And I put those pictures together for a while and I looked at them and I realized that, I mean, I came to this conclusion that Dick was basically photographing himself to take his measure against Robert Frank.
Right.
That Robert Frank was the real thing in Dick's mind, and in fact, Robert Frank couldn't be bothered with, you know, the urban gloss. I mean, he thought it was all ridiculous, and you know, and how could this man be so confident, you know, about who he was and how he proceeded in life without all of the, you know, like cultural scaffolding that Dick brought with him. So I think that, so I thought that's one way, that's just one example of many that I would look at pictures and just think about them and think about, you know, I don't know, any number of things. I don't know, but that's just one example of, I mean, the pictures inform me, you know, consistently and continuously. And I would look at a picture and I go, okay, let's retrace this. Like, how did he make this picture? Where was he? Why did he choose this model? One thing would lead to another. You know, I read Dorian Lee's autobiography. She was one of his earliest models. Yeah. So, you know, just from that, just from looking at the pictures of her in Harper's Bazaar, thinking, well, who is she? Why does he keep using her? You know, let me start exploring her and like that, you know.
Yeah. You have a profound sense of it. It's
Thank
amazing.
You. It was fun.
Okay, so we've got another question.
Oh, good.
Not quite time to go, although we're nearly at precision timing. Please comment on Avedon's relationship to and competition with Irving Penn. That's from Claire.
Hi, Claire. Hi, Claire. You know, people always thought they were rivals, and you know, there they were. They were both alone at the top of their profession, alone together. You know, hovering above the world. They respected each other. They had a very kind of friendly relationship. They didn't see each other all that often, but when they did, it was, you know, with mutual admiration. Penn was often very complimentary about Avedon's work. They led a workshop together, kind of a Brodkey workshop in 1962 or 4, I can't remember now. And they understood things about the profession that nobody else did. So they actually would confer intermittently, you know, about, I don't know, whether, you know, contracts or fees or whatever it may be, because nobody else understood their particular problems or issues. So it was always cordial. And I mean, the irony of that question, in fact, is that I only met Richard Avedon twice. Once was I sat next to him at a dinner, a Museum of Modern Art dinner, at the opening of the Irving Penn show. And so he was obviously invited to that opening, and we didn't talk about Penn. We actually, the only thing I remember about the conversation was that we talked about Lyme disease, because it was when Lyme disease was kind of surfacing in the world in 1984, and in fact, this is a little aside, Renata Adler was also at our table, and I really had wanted to sit next to her because she had written this like just vicious but brilliant evisceration of Pauline Kael in the New York Review of Books. That's now like a very well-known essay, and I wanted to talk to her about that, but she was across the table, and so I talked to Dick about Lyme disease. He was very charming, but he didn't talk about Irving Penn. But at least he was there. So.
I'm going to come on to our final question, but I just wanted to say another great revelation for me in the book in terms of Penn and Avedon was the fact that Penn was obviously an intense, committed printer. Like, he rendered the pictures in the darkroom, whereas Avedon, it's not that he didn't know what he wanted to achieve, but that was not the kind of centrifugal photographic component.
That's true. That's true. So Irving Penn, is known for his, he's known for a lot of things, but his platinum prints specifically. And there was a moment when he recognized that like the paper stock was getting worse for the magazines. He was working for Vogue for years, and he hated the way his pictures looked in the magazine. And so he decided to make one-of-a-kind prints of his images. And it's a very intricate and rigorous process making a platinum print, like at that period, in that period of time. So he was very much of a formalist in terms of, as an artist, Irving Penn, and focused on that and did that himself. Dick had, a kind of an army of printers and assistants who did his printing, but that doesn't mean that he was not obsessive about the quality of his prints. He was obsessive. And he understood what Dick understood, and this is really major, in terms of, I think, art history and his art historical gesture, I will say this again, is that he understood that he was working with a particular form and a medium, and he was always addressing that medium. When you look at his pictures, they are purely photographic, and he's bringing it to the optimal, like the most you can get out of the print. So his prints are gorgeous. It's just that he didn't print them, but he would look at them and send them back to be printed again. Often like driving his assistants nuts with like circling. He would circle a portrait, like he'd make 11 different circles, and each one was a different grade or tone, on the zone scale, and it would drive him crazy. But he would get out of them, these amazing prints.
Okay, I've got a strategy. We're going to go for 3 minutes. We've got 3 questions.
Okay.
So how about a quick response to 3 questions? Does that
sound good? Sure. Okay. Sure.
I think it's a question, which is, can you say something about the relationship between Avedon and James Baldwin after high school? That's from Jen.
So they didn't see each other very much, but in 1963, Dick photographed James Baldwin for Harper's Bazaar, and he was becoming very kind of public and vocal, James Baldwin, at the rise of the civil rights movement. And so Dick did a book called Nothing Personal, and James Baldwin wrote the essay. And it was kind of a year-long process for Dick photographing. He was kind of portraitizing the issues of kind of the racial condition. And James Baldwin wrote the essay, but Dick had to kind of travel around to kind of like crack the whip for James. This is terrible. Never mind. He to get James Baldwin to kind of finish the essay, and he traveled far and wide. He traveled to Puerto Rico, where Baldwin was doing some things, and he traveled to Finland, where James Baldwin was at a symposium, and like he said, you've got to finish the essay. It's due like now, and so that's basically. They weren't that close, but they were intermittently close over the course of their lives in that way.
And we have a question from the lovely Sean Waldron, which is, how pivotal was the relationship between Avedon and Vreeland?
Hi, Sean. They worked like consistently together for years and years and years, and Dick had enormous respect for her. She had style and vision and imagination, and he adored that. And so they were not, I wouldn't say that they were actually friends, but they were great working colleagues.
Yeah. I think the matching of those, it's like, oh, that's interesting. I don't care if they adored each other or not. It's just like, about 2 forces. Okay, it's the wonderful Frisch Brandt who gets to ask the final question, which is, Philip, now that you've been through the rabbit hole of Avedon, what's next?
If only you could answer that question. There are ideas percolating, and I think I need another 3 months of, my evening martini so I can just get lost in my consciousness dream and figure that out.
Great answer. I don't know how we end this other than I just want to thank you. I adore you. Your book is
thank you.
It's a ripping yarn. And I can't wait to
that's the best
more.
thing you could say about it, a ripping yarn. I love that.
You're a joy.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Charlotte, for this conversation. It was actually, a dream. It had the spontaneity of an Avedon fashion picture. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you both so much. That was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
I didn't really know about him, so it was amazing to learn. So
oh, good.
I hope that a bunch of new people learn about him now after this. So thank you both so much for being with us tonight. Thank you everyone who watched and joined us. I hope you have wonderful rest of your night and week and December. And cheers to 2021. Believe it or not.
Yes. Bye. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Have a great night.
Bye. Bye.